Knowing is light that falls on a surface and moves on, while remembering is heat that stays long after the light is gone. Knowing collects facts, names, sequences, definitions, and stores them neatly, as if the mind were a shelf built to hold objects that can be taken down and examined at will. Remembering does not sit on shelves. It settles into the body, into habits, into reflexes, into the way silence feels familiar or threatening. A person can know thousands of things without being shaped by them, yet a single memory can quietly alter the course of a life without ever being spoken aloud. Knowing is often clean and orderly. It prefers clarity. Remembering is rarely clean. It mixes emotion with fragments, rearranges details, softens edges, sharpens others, and refuses to stay still. What you know can usually be explained. What you remember often cannot. Knowledge arrives through words, books, voices, screens, lessons. Memory arrives through experience, repetition, shock, comfort, loss. You can know that fire is hot, but remembering heat comes from the moment your hand moved too close and your body learned before your mind did. Knowledge tells you what happened. Memory decides what mattered. Over time, knowing grows heavier. Facts accumulate. Dates pile up. Names blur. Memory grows quieter. It does not multiply. It condenses. Years pass, and entire decades reduce themselves to a few sensations, a few images, a handful of moments that refuse to fade. Knowing belongs to the present mind. Remembering belongs to the past self that still lives somewhere underneath. This is why knowledge can change quickly while memory resists. You can replace incorrect information in a moment. You cannot so easily replace a memory, even when you wish it were gone. Knowledge obeys logic. Memory obeys feeling. Knowledge answers when called. Memory appears when it wants, often when you are tired, unfocused, or alone. In quiet moments, memory rises not as a story, but as an atmosphere. A weight in the chest, a calm that has no source, a tension with no clear cause. This is because memory does not speak the language of explanation. It speaks the language of recognition. You do not remember by effort. You recognize without trying. And in that recognition, you realize that what you carry is not information, but imprint. Knowing tells you who you think you are. Remembering tells you who you have been. The two coexist, but they do not merge. One can be updated, corrected, refined. The other can only be revisited. Over a lifetime, knowledge may expand endlessly, but memory becomes selective, almost protective, keeping only what it believes is essential, not what was accurate, but what was significant, not what was proven, but what was felt. In this way, memory is not a record of truth, but a record of meaning. And meaning does not need to be correct to be powerful. There is a quiet moment that reveals this difference more clearly than any definition. It happens when someone tries to recall a simple fact and cannot, and yet they can vividly re-enter a scene from years ago with no effort at all. The mind forgets the number, but the body remembers the room. The mind loses the date, but the senses remember the air. A certain kind of music drifts through a wall, and suddenly the present becomes thin, as if it were only a veil. You are not thinking about the past. You are inside it. Knowledge rarely does that. Knowledge is a map you unfold on a table. Memory is the terrain under your feet. This is why two people can know the same event happened and still carry entirely different realities of it. They agree on the outline, but the imprint is not shared. One remembers the sound of a chair scraping the floor. One remembers the color of the light. One remembers the pause before a sentence, the breath before a choice, the way a face looked away. The brain can recite the facts, yet the heart keeps the details that never made it into language. Many memories are not stored as stories at all. They are stored as reactions. A person does not always remember why they distrust a certain tone of voice, but the distrust arrives instantly. A person may not remember the first time they felt abandoned, but they will feel it again in a new situation as if it were the same old wound opening. Knowledge can tell them they are safe. Memory can disagree. This is the hidden authority of remembering. It does not argue, it simply directs. It leans the mind toward caution or toward comfort without explanation. It teaches preferences. It shapes boundaries. It decides what feels familiar and what feels dangerous. In that sense, memory is older than knowledge. Knowledge learns through interpretation. Memory learns through impact. Knowledge requires attention. Memory can be formed even when you are not paying attention at all. A child may not understand the words adults say, but they will remember the temperature of the room, the tension in the air, the way footsteps sounded approaching the door. Later, as an adult, they may know the explanation for what happened, yet still feel the same unease when footsteps sound the same way. Knowledge is the mind's attempt to create order. Memory is the nervous system's attempt to protect. Because of this, memory can become a private world that runs alongside reality. It is always there, quietly comparing the present to the past, searching for matches, reading patterns, noticing echoes. And when it finds an echo, it does not care if the situation is truly the same. It cares only that it feels the same. That is enough to trigger an old response. This is also why memory can be both a gift and a burden. It gives continuity, identity, texture. It lets you return to warmth, to places that no longer exist, to voices you cannot hear again. It can keep people alive inside you in ways knowledge never could. But it can also keep pain alive, preserved with astonishing precision, not as a clear narrative, but as a sensation that refuses to dissolve. Knowledge says time has passed. Memory sometimes behaves as if time never did. As time moves forward, knowledge tends to expand outward, while memory contracts inward. You learn more names, more systems, more explanations, more reasons. Memory does not compete with this growth. It withdraws, becoming denser, more concentrated, as if it were distilling itself. Entire years can fade into a single image. Entire relationships can compress into a single feeling. This compression is not a failure. It is how memory survives. The mind cannot carry everything, so memory keeps what it considers essential for recognition and survival. This is why some moments vanish completely, while others remain sharp decades later. It is not importance in the logical sense that decides this. It is intensity, repetition, and emotional weight. Knowledge remembers what was told. Memory remembers what was endured. Over time, knowledge becomes easier to question. New information replaces old beliefs. Corrections happen. Memory, however, resists revision. Even when you understand a memory is distorted, even when you know the facts no longer support it, the feeling often remains unchanged. This creates a strange internal divide. One part of the mind knows better, another part feels otherwise, and the feeling often wins. This is not weakness, it is hierarchy. Memory sits closer to the core systems that regulate safety, attachment, and identity. Knowledge operates at a distance from those systems. It can advise, it can suggest, it rarely commands. Memory commands quietly. This is why people sometimes act against what they know to be true. They are not ignorant. They are loyal to an older internal logic. Memory teaches through repetition. When something happens once, it may be noticed. When it happens many times, it becomes expectation. Knowledge says not everything repeats. Memory says enough things did. This difference explains why change is so difficult, even when understanding is clear. A person may know a situation is different now, yet their body prepares for what it remembers. Knowledge points forward. Memory looks backward. Both believe they are protecting you. There is also a subtle cruelty in memory's efficiency. It does not preserve happiness with the same intensity it preserves threat. Calm moments often blur together. Danger sharpens itself. This bias is ancient. It kept humans alive when forgetting danger meant death. But in a modern world, it can trap the mind in patterns that no longer serve it. Knowledge tries to balance this by offering perspective. It explains probability. It introduces nuance. Memory does not listen to probability. It listens to familiarity. A familiar pain can feel safer than an unfamiliar calm. This is why people sometimes return to situations they know will hurt them. The pain is known. The alternative is not. Knowledge protests. Memory reassures. Over long periods, this dynamic shapes identity more than facts ever could. A person becomes not just what they know, but what they remember expecting. They learn who they are allowed to be, how much space they can take, how loud they can speak, how close they can stand. These lessons are rarely taught explicitly. They are remembered into existence. Memory is education without words. It does not announce itself. It simply adjusts behavior until the adjustment feels natural. Eventually, it becomes invisible. You do not feel like you are obeying a memory. You feel like you are being yourself. And unless examined, the difference between those two can disappear entirely. There comes a point where knowing and remembering begin to diverge so far that they seem to describe two different lives happening inside the same person. On the surface, knowledge builds a narrative of progress. You know more than you once did. You understand causes, consequences, systems, motivations. You can explain yourself better. You can articulate boundaries, intentions, beliefs. But underneath that structure, memory continues to operate on older rules. It does not care how well you can explain your choices. It cares how those choices feel compared to what came before. This is why someone can appear confident and still feel fragile. Knowledge has learned stability. Memory still remembers instability. This internal split often reveals itself in quiet moments rather than dramatic ones. A pause before speaking, a hesitation before resting, a tension that appears when nothing is wrong. Knowledge scans the situation and finds no threat. Memory scans the feeling and finds a resemblance. The resemblance is enough. Memory does not search for truth. It searches for continuity. It wants the present to make sense in relation to the past, even if that sense is painful. In this way, memory can distort the present not by adding false information, but by amplifying certain signals and muting others. Knowledge may say a silence is neutral. Memory may remember silence as rejection. Knowledge may say distance is temporary. Memory may remember distance as loss. These interpretations happen instantly, below language, before reasoning has time to intervene. And once they happen, knowledge is forced into a defensive role. It explains after the reaction has already begun. This can create exhaustion. The mind feels like it is constantly correcting itself, constantly reminding itself of what it knows, constantly negotiating with what it remembers. Over time, this negotiation can shape behavior in subtle ways. People may avoid situations that trigger memories, not because they consciously fear them, but because their energy drains faster in those spaces. They may gravitate toward environments that feel familiar, even if those environments limit growth. Knowledge may value expansion. Memory values predictability. Predictability feels safe, even when it is constricting. This is why routine can feel comforting and change can feel threatening, regardless of how positive that change appears on paper. Memory treats novelty as uncertainty. Knowledge treats novelty as opportunity. Both are correct within their own logic. The tension arises when one is allowed to dominate completely. A life ruled only by knowledge can become detached, overly rational, disconnected from feeling. A life ruled only by memory can become repetitive, cautious, confined. Balance is not achieved by choosing one over the other, but by recognizing their different roles. Knowledge is a tool for navigation. Memory is a signal system for survival. Problems arise when memory is mistaken for prophecy. Just because something feels familiar does not mean it is inevitable. Just because a reaction is strong does not mean it is accurate. Memory is persuasive because it speaks in sensation, not argument. It feels immediate. It feels true, but truth and familiarity are not the same thing. Still, memory cannot simply be overridden. It must be experienced, noticed, allowed to pass without being mistaken for instruction. This requires patience. Memory does not unlearn quickly. It updates slowly through repetition of new experiences that contradict old patterns. Knowledge can accept a new idea in seconds. Memory may need years of consistency to soften. When it does, it rarely announces the change. One day, a familiar trigger appears, and the reaction is quieter than before. Not gone, just softer. This is memory learning something new without words. It is remembering a different ending. Memory's slow pace is often mistaken for resistance, but it is closer to caution. It was built to protect continuity, not to chase improvement. When something has kept you alive or intact before, memory treats it as valuable, even if knowledge later identifies it as limiting. This is why memory rarely responds to arguments. It responds to evidence lived through the body. Reassurance spoken once is knowledge. Reassurance experienced repeatedly becomes memory. Over time. This distinction explains why advice so often fails, while experience quietly succeeds. You can tell someone they are safe, capable, accepted. They may know it is true, but until their nervous system recognizes it through consistent experience, the knowing remains external, like a signpost they pass without stopping. Memory requires confirmation, not persuasion. It listens for patterns, not promises. This is also why memory can feel stubborn in moments of change. When circumstances improve suddenly, knowledge celebrates. Memory hesitates. It waits to see if the improvement lasts. It scans for reversal. It prepares for disappointment, not because it expects failure, but because it remembers surprise. Memory distrusts sudden shifts because past sudden shifts often preceded loss. Knowledge may say this time is different. Memory replies by slowing down, holding back, conserving energy. In this way, memory protects not happiness, but recovery. It would rather delay joy than risk collapse. This protective instinct can look like self-sabotage when viewed through the lens of knowledge alone. From the perspective of memory, it is restraint, it is pacing, it is survival through moderation. Memory's loyalty is not to the future, but to the system that has already endured. Another subtle difference between knowing and remembering appears in how each handles uncertainty. Knowledge wants answers. It seeks clarity, resolution, explanation. Memory is more comfortable with ambiguity. It does not need everything to make sense. It only needs things to feel familiar enough to navigate. This is why memory can coexist with contradiction. A person can remember someone as loving and harmful at the same time without needing to resolve the conflict. Knowledge struggles with this. It wants coherence. Memory allows overlap. It stores impressions side by side, even when they oppose each other. This capacity makes memory richer but also heavier. It carries complexity without any simplifying it. Over time, this weight can surface as fatigue, nostalgia, or a quiet longing that has no clear object. Knowledge might interpret this as confusion. Memory experiences it as accumulation, years of impressions layered without release. This is why repetition matters so deeply to memory. Repetition smooths sharp edges. It tells memory that something new is stable enough to be trusted. One good experience does not rewrite a past pattern. Many similar experiences begin to. Slowly, memory adjusts its expectations. The body relaxes sooner. The reaction softens faster. The old tension loosens its grip. Knowledge may have accepted the change long ago, but memory is only now catching up. When this happens, it can feel like relief without explanation, a sense of ease that appears unexpectedly. Nothing dramatic has changed in the present moment. What has changed is the background. Memory has updated its forecast. It has recorded a new pattern. This process cannot be rushed. Memory, does not operate on deadlines. It operates on exposure. This is why environments matter so much. Places, sounds, rhythms, and routines feed memory constantly, whether noticed or not. A calm environment repeated becomes remembered safety. A chaotic environment repeated becomes remembered vigilance. Knowledge may adapt intellectually, but memory absorbs atmospheres directly. It learns what kind of world it lives in based on what surrounds it most often. Over a lifetime, this silent learning shapes temperament more than belief. A person raised in unpredictability may know stability exists, yet still feel alert within it. A person raised in calm may know danger exists, yet move through the world with ease. Neither is wrong. Each is remembered, and until memory encounters enough evidence to revise itself, knowing will remain a voice, while remembering remains the climate in which that voice speaks. As memory continues to shape the inner climate, it quietly influences what feels real, even when knowledge offers a different interpretation. Reality, as experienced, is not built solely from facts, but from remembered sensations layered over the present moment. Two people can stand in the same room, hear the same words, and walk away, carrying different realities, not because one misunderstood, but because memory filtered the experience before understanding could form. Memory acts as a lens. It tints perception, adjusts contrast, amplifies certain tones, dulls others. Knowledge arrives afterward, trying to describe what was seen through that lens, often unaware that the lens itself altered the view. This is why debates about truth so often fail to change how people feel. Knowledge argues about content. Memory governs context. Context decides impact. A calm statement spoken in a familiar tone can feel safe. The same statement spoken in a tone that echoes an old memory can feel threatening, regardless of intent. Knowledge may insist on intention. Memory responds to resonance. Over time, this resonance becomes automatic. The body reacts before the mind labels. The heart rate shifts before words form. Knowledge catches up later, offering explanations that feel incomplete because the experience has already passed through memory's filter. This does not mean memory is accurate. It means memory is influential. Its power comes from immediacy, from its closeness to sensation. Knowledge operates through distance. It analyzes. It separates. Memory immerses. It does not observe the experience. It recreates it internally. This recreation is not exact. Details change, edges blur, but the emotional core remains intact. Memory preserves feeling more reliably than fact. This is why a remembered moment can feel vivid even when its details are wrong. The accuracy of memory is less important to its function than its emotional signal. Memory is not trying to archive the past. It is trying to prepare the future. Every remembered sensation becomes data for prediction. When something feels familiar, memory predicts what comes next based on what came before. These predictions operate silently, shaping expectations and responses without conscious permission. Knowledge may argue that the prediction is flawed. Memory proceeds anyway because it values continuity over correction. To memory, a false positive is safer than a missed warning. This bias makes memory conservative, protective, sometimes pessimistic. Knowledge may label this as irrational. Memory labels it as caution. The tension between these two creates much of the inner friction people feel. They know one thing and feel another. They understand a situation and still react as if they do not. This friction is not a flaw. It is the byproduct of two systems designed for different purposes, sharing the same space. Over time, people often learn to trust one more than the other. Some lean heavily on knowledge, dismissing feeling as unreliable. Others lean heavily on memory, dismissing analysis as cold or detached. Both approaches carry cost. Ignoring memory can lead to burnout because unacknowledged sensations accumulate pressure. Ignoring knowledge can lead to stagnation because unchallenged patterns repeat endlessly. Integration does not mean agreement. It means recognition. Knowing when a reaction comes from memory rather than the present, knowing when understanding is sufficient and when experience is required. This awareness does not erase memory's influence, but it changes the relationship. Memory becomes a signal rather than a command. Knowledge becomes a guide rather than a judge. In this relationship, growth happens quietly, not through sudden insight, but through repeated moments where the present differs enough from the past that memory begins to notice. Each time a feared outcome does not arrive, memory hesitates a little longer before reacting. Each time safety is experienced where danger was expected, memory adjusts its baseline. These adjustments are subtle. They do not feel like breakthroughs. They feel like quiet shifts in atmosphere. Less tension, more space, a softer response. Knowledge may have understood the possibility long ago. Memory is only now accepting it. And when memory accepts, the change feels real, not because it is explained, but because it is lived. In the later stages of life, the difference between knowing and remembering becomes even more pronounced as knowledge continues to accumulate while memory begins to shed weight. Facts become harder to retrieve, names slip away, timelines lose their precision, yet certain memories remain untouched, as if protected from erosion. These are rarely the most important events in an objective sense. They are the moments where feeling and meaning were tightly bound. A look exchanged without words, a room filled with a particular kind of light, a sense of being understood or dismissed. Knowledge may fail with age, but memory often preserves atmosphere. This reveals something essential about its purpose. Memory was never meant to be a database. It was meant to be a compass. It does not point to what happened. It points to what mattered. As the mind loosens its grip on detail, memory distills identity into a smaller set of impressions. A person may forget what they accomplished, yet remember how they felt when they were at peace. They may forget struggles, yet retain the shape of resilience those struggles formed. Knowledge fades in pieces. Memory fades in layers. When it fades, it does not disappear evenly. It thins at the edges, leaving a core that feels strangely intact. This core often guides behavior even when explanation is no longer possible. Someone may not remember why a certain place feels safe, but they will move toward it instinctively. They may not remember the origin of a fear, but they will still avoid its echo. In this way, memory continues to function even when knowledge fails. It becomes quieter, simpler, more symbolic. It no longer tells stories. It signals directions. This transition reveals how deeply memory is tied to the body rather than the intellect. Long after names and facts dissolve, posture remains, tone remains. The way a person responds to warmth or threat remains. Knowledge is fragile because it depends on retrieval. Memory endures because it is embedded. It lives in reflex, in rhythm, in preference. This endurance is both comforting and unsettling. It suggests that who a person is cannot be fully lost, even when much of what they know disappears. At the same time, it shows how little of identity was ever constructed from knowledge alone. Memory, for all its distortions, holds the emotional truth of a life more faithfully than facts ever could. This is why stories told late in life often drift, looping around the same sensations rather than progressing linearly. Knowledge seeks sequence. Memory seeks resonance. The story is not told to inform. It is told to feel again. Listening to such stories requires a different kind of attention. Correcting details misses the point. The point is not accuracy. It is presence. The same principle applies earlier in life, though it is easier to overlook. People are always carrying more remembered feeling than known information. Their reactions, preferences, and fears make sense when viewed through the lens of memory, even when they appear illogical through the lens of knowledge. Understanding this does not mean surrendering to memory's authority. It means respecting its function. Memory kept track of what knowledge could not articulate at the time. It recorded the unspoken, the overlooked, the emotionally charged. Knowledge may arrive later with clarity, but memory was there first, absorbing without judgment. When these two are allowed to coexist without hierarchy, something stabilizes. The mind no longer has to constantly override itself. Knowledge informs, memory signals. Each stays in its role. The present becomes easier to inhabit because it is no longer confused with the past. The past remains influential but not dominant. In this balance, the difference between knowing and remembering is no longer a conflict. It becomes a division of labor. One explains the world. The other explains why the world feels the way it does. When this division of labor is understood, a subtle shift occurs in how experience is interpreted. Moments no longer demand immediate explanation. Sensations are allowed to exist without being forced into conclusions. A tightening in the chest does not instantly become a verdict. A wave of calm does not require justification. Knowledge learns to wait. Memory learns to be observed. This creates space between stimulus and response, a space that did not exist before. In that space, choice becomes possible. Not the loud kind of choice that announces itself, but the quiet kind that slightly alters direction. Memory still speaks first, but its voice is no longer mistaken for command. It becomes information, knowledge, listens without arguing. Over time, this listening changes the tone of inner experience. The world feels less reactive, not because threats have vanished, but because not every signal is treated as urgent. Memory begins to trust that knowledge will intervene when needed. Knowledge begins to trust that memory is offering context, not destiny. This mutual trust is built slowly through consistency rather than insight. It is reinforced each time an old reaction appears and nothing terrible follows. Each time a familiar fear is met with a different outcome, memory takes note. It does not celebrate. It does not announce progress. It simply adjusts its expectations slightly downward. The body relaxes a fraction sooner. The breath deepens without instruction. These small changes accumulate. Over months and years, they reshape the internal landscape more effectively than any argument ever could. This is how memory relearns safety, not through convincing explanations, but through lived contradiction. Knowledge plays a supporting role in this process. It names what is happening after the fact. It offers perspective when confusion arises. It reminds the mind that change is allowed to be gradual. Memory does not rush. It never has. Its pace is measured in exposure, not intention. When change is consistent, memory adapts. When change is erratic, memory retreats. This sensitivity explains why stable environments heal more than intense interventions. Memory responds to rhythm. Regularity teaches it what to expect. A steady tone, a predictable routine, a repeated absence of threat. These elements communicate safety more clearly than reassurance ever could. Knowledge may understand this intellectually. Memory understands it physically. This physical understanding is what allows the present to separate itself from the past. The present becomes a distinct experience rather than a replay. When this separation strengthens, identity loosens. People feel less defined by what happened to them and more by what is happening now. Knowledge often claims this shift as a change in belief. Memory experiences it as a change in atmosphere. The air feels different, lighter, more neutral, less charged. This neutrality is not emptiness. It is availability. It allows new impressions to form without being immediately compared to old ones. Memory becomes curious rather than defensive. It still records, but with less urgency. It no longer needs to be on constant alert. Knowledge, in turn, becomes less rigid. It no longer has to constantly justify or explain inner states. It can observe without correcting. In this state, the difference between knowing and remembering becomes something to be respected rather than resolved. Each has its domain. Knowing organizes meaning. Remembering preserves continuity. Together, they allow a person to move forward without severing the past and to honor the past without being trapped by it. The fire continues to burn quietly in the background, repeating its simple pattern. It does not analyze itself. It does not remember yesterday's flame, yet it carries heat forward all the same. In that repetition without reflection, there is a reminder. Not everything needs to be known to be felt. Not everything remembered needs to be relived. Some things are allowed to warm the present without explaining their origin. Eventually, there is an acceptance that knowing and remembering will never fully align, and that this misalignment is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be lived with. A person can understand their history clearly and still feel echoes of it in moments where it no longer applies. They can know why something happened and still carry the residue of how it felt. This residue does not disappear simply because it has been explained. Explanation belongs to knowledge. Residue belongs to memory. The mistake is assuming that understanding should erase sensation. It does not. It contextualizes it. Memory was never designed to be erased by insight. It was designed to be integrated through experience. This is why insight alone often feels incomplete. It satisfies the mind but leaves the body unchanged. True change happens when insight is followed by repetition, when the present consistently contradicts the past in ways that are gentle enough to be absorbed. Memory softens not through force, but through reliability. It watches quietly. It waits. When the same outcome occurs again and again without harm, memory begins to loosen its grip. This loosening can feel unsettling at first. Old reactions, even painful ones, carry familiarity. Letting them go can feel like losing a part of oneself. Knowledge may frame this as growth. Memory experiences it as disorientation. It takes time for memory to understand that safety can exist without constant vigilance. During this transition, there can be moments of emptiness where old patterns no longer dominate but new ones have not yet formed. Knowledge may rush to fill this space with meaning. Memory needs time to sit in it. This empty space is not a void. It is a pause between imprints. It allows the nervous system to rest, to reset, to experience the present without immediately categorizing it. Over time, this pause becomes a resource. It offers flexibility. It allows response rather than reflex. Knowledge often seeks mastery over experience. Memory seeks coherence. When coherence is restored, mastery becomes unnecessary. Life feels navigable without constant explanation. Situations are met as they are, not as reminders of what once was. This does not mean the past is forgotten. It means it is no longer mistaken for the present. Memory still exists, but it no longer demands repetition. It becomes reference rather than script. In this state, identity feels less rigid. A person is no longer defined solely by what they remember enduring, nor by what they know about themselves. They are defined by what they can now experience without collapsing into old responses. Knowledge may describe this as resilience. Memory experiences it as permission. Permission to rest, permission to respond differently, permission to not anticipate harm where none appears. This permission is subtle. It does not arrive as confidence or certainty. It arrives as reduced tension, as a quieter background, as fewer internal interruptions. Over time, these small shifts accumulate into a different way of being, not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual reorientation. Knowing continues to expand, offering context and language. Remembering continues to condense, offering texture and continuity. Neither dominates, neither disappears. They coexist, each doing what it does best. In this coexistence, the mind no longer fights itself. The present is allowed to be present. The past is allowed to remain past, influential but not directive. The fire burns steadily, indifferent to analysis, faithful to its rhythm. It does not need to remember yesterday, to provide warmth today. It simply continues. And in that continuation, there is a quiet lesson. Some forms of understanding come not from knowing more, but from allowing memory to finally rest. With time, the quiet cooperation between knowing and remembering becomes less noticeable, not because it has disappeared, but because it no longer creates friction. What once felt like an internal argument softens into background awareness. Memory still produces signals, but they arrive with less urgency. Knowledge still interprets, but with less insistence. The present moment gains more autonomy. It is no longer immediately recruited into the service of the past. This autonomy changes how attention functions. Instead of scanning constantly for confirmation or threat, attention lingers. It stays with what is actually happening. Sounds are heard without evaluation. Silence is not immediately filled. The body settles into a rhythm that does not require explanation. Knowledge might describe this as presence. Memory experiences it as a reduction in load. Less comparison, less prediction, less replay. This reduction does not erase identity. It clarifies it. When memory is no longer busy defending against echoes, it becomes available for new imprints. These imprints form differently. They are lighter, less dramatic, more distributed. They do not demand permanence. They simply register and pass. Over time, this changes what is remembered. The future memory bank fills not with sharp peaks of intensity, but with a broader sense of continuity. Life feels less like a series of defining moments and more like a sustained tone. Knowledge often struggles with this shift because it prefers landmarks. Memory adapts more easily than expected once safety is established. It does not need extremes to learn. It responds to consistency. As consistency increases, memory's need to warn diminishes. It becomes quieter not because it has failed, but because its task has been fulfilled. Knowledge, freed from constant correction, also changes. It becomes less defensive. It no longer needs to constantly justify feelings or override reactions. It can operate with humility, aware of its limits. This humility strengthens it. Knowing becomes flexible rather than rigid. It accommodates uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. In this state, the difference between knowing and remembering no longer feels like a divide. It feels like depth. Knowledge provides structure. Memory provides texture. Together, they create a sense of reality that is neither purely conceptual nor purely reactive. It is lived. This lived reality does not demand constant interpretation. It allows experience to stand on its own. When something is painful, it is painful without becoming prophetic. When something is calm, it is calm without suspicion. Memory still notes these states, but without urgency. Knowledge still understands them, but without dominance. Over a long life, this balance becomes the quiet, foundation beneath thought and behavior. It does not announce itself. It does not claim achievement. It simply supports movement forward. The person moves through the world with less resistance, not because the world has changed, but because the internal negotiation has settled. Knowing and remembering continue side by side, neither trying to replace the other. One explains, one endures, and in their steady coexistence, the mind finds a form of rest that no amount of information alone could ever provide. At the very end of this process, there is a quiet realization that knowing and remembering were never meant to compete for control, but to serve different layers of the same experience. Knowing belongs to awareness. Remembering belongs to continuity. One helps you orient yourself in the present. The other ensures you remain intact across time. When they are confused for one another, life feels unstable. When they are distinguished, life gains depth without becoming heavy. Memory, no longer needs to shout to be heard. Knowledge no longer needs to dominate to be effective. Each settles into its natural range. In this state, reflection becomes gentler. The past can be visited without pulling the present apart. Recollection loses its edge and gains perspective, not because details have vanished, but because they no longer demand interpretation. Memory becomes more symbolic than literal, carrying themes rather than scenes, impressions rather than images. Knowledge, in turn, becomes more spacious. It allows ambiguity without anxiety. It does not rush to categorize every sensation. It understands that not everything felt needs to be solved. This understanding changes how meaning is formed. Meaning no longer comes only from explanation or analysis, it arises from coherence over time. A life begins to feel meaningful, not because it makes sense intellectually, but because it feels internally consistent. Memory recognizes this consistency before knowledge names it. There is less need to revisit old narratives, less compulsion to reframe the past. The story has already been integrated at a level deeper than language. What remains is not a conclusion, but a tone, a sense of how it feels to exist within one's own experience without constant correction. This tone becomes the quiet backdrop against which daily life unfolds. It is not excitement. It is not certainty. It is steadiness. Knowing supports this steadiness by offering clarity when needed. Remembering supports it by offering continuity without intrusion. Together, they allow the present moment to breathe. The fire burns on, unchanged in its simplicity, giving warmth without explanation, light without intention. It does not store its past flames. It does not anticipate future ones. Yet it remains the same fire. In that persistence without memory and that presence without knowledge, there is an echo of balance. Not everything must be held in mind to be carried forward. Not everything that shaped you needs to remain active to remain true. Some things are allowed to fade into background warmth, influencing without directing, supporting without demanding. In this quiet equilibrium, knowing and remembering finally stop pulling in different directions. They align not through agreement, but through acceptance of their limits. One understands the world, the other understands the self, and between them, experience continues, steady, unforced, and complete. Beyond this equilibrium, life continues without marking a clear boundary where the work is finished. Knowing and remembering remain active, but they no longer require attention. They function like systems that have learned each other's rhythms. Memory still reacts at times, but its reactions are proportional. Knowledge still analyzes, but its analysis is restrained. The mind is no longer preoccupied with reconciling the two. This allows energy to move elsewhere. Attention turns outward without losing inward stability. Experience is no longer filtered primarily through comparison with the past. It is met more directly. This directness does not remove complexity, but it reduces distortion. Events are allowed to register as themselves. A disappointment is a disappointment, not evidence. A success is a success, not a test. Memory notes these events, but does not immediately assign them weight beyond their scale. Knowledge understands them, but does not inflate them into identity. Over time, this changes how time itself is felt. The past feels less intrusive. The future feels less demanding. The present expands slightly, becoming a place where attention can rest rather than rush. This expansion is subtle. It does not announce itself as peace or fulfillment. It feels more like spaciousness, fewer internal interruptions, less urgency to resolve what is already unfolding. Memory adapts to this spaciousness by slowing its projections. It no longer scans constantly for confirmation of old patterns. Knowledge adapts by loosening its grip on certainty. It becomes comfortable operating with incomplete information. This mutual adaptation makes life feel more fluid. Decisions are made with less internal debate. Responses emerge without excessive rehearsal. Silence becomes tolerable. Stillness becomes usable. In this state, reflection changes its character. It is no longer driven by the need to understand or correct the past. It becomes observational. One can notice how experiences have shaped them without feeling compelled to rewrite those experiences. Memory is allowed to exist as residue rather than instruction. Knowledge is allowed to exist as context rather than authority. This balance does not eliminate pain or uncertainty. It changes their scale. Pain no longer threatens identity. Uncertainty no longer demands immediate resolution. Both are integrated as part of the ongoing process rather than interruptions to it. Over a long horizon, this integration leads to a quieter form of resilience, not the kind built from endurance or toughness, but the kind built from flexibility. Memory bends rather than hardens. Knowledge adapts rather than insists. Together, they allow movement without collapse. The fire continues its steady pattern, offering a simple parallel. It consumes what it touches, transforms it, and releases what it no longer needs as ash. It does not cling to what it has burned. It does not mourn what has passed through it, yet its warmth carries forward. In the same way, experience is processed, remembered, and released. What remains is not the detail, but the effect, the warmth, the imprint. Knowing and remembering participate in this cycle, each contributing what they can, neither holding on longer than necessary. And so the story does not end with a conclusion, but with continuation. Experience moves forward, informed by what was known, shaped by what was remembered, and open to what has not yet arrived. In this continuation, the relationship between knowing and remembering becomes almost invisible, like breathing. It happens without effort, without instruction. Memory still stores impressions, but it no longer hoards them. Knowledge still gathers understanding, but it no longer tries to dominate experience. The two operate in parallel, each respecting the boundary the other requires. This respect allows life to feel less reactive and more responsive. When something unexpected happens, memory registers it, but does not immediately search the past for a template. Knowledge evaluates it, but does not rush to label it as threat or promise. The moment is allowed to exist long enough to reveal its own shape. This allowance changes the texture of time. Moments stretch slightly, not because they are dramatic, but because they are not immediately consumed by interpretation. Memory notices this difference. It records not intensity, but steadiness. Over time, steadiness becomes its new reference point. The nervous system recalibrates. Alertness becomes optional rather than constant. Knowledge supports this recalibration by reinforcing context when confusion arises, but it no longer feels responsible for managing every internal state. This redistribution of responsibility lightens the mind. Thoughts move more freely, emotions pass with less resistance, reflection becomes quieter. Instead of looping back to old narratives, it drifts forward, curious rather than defensive. Memory, relieved of its need to protect constantly, becomes more selective. It lets many experiences pass without imprinting deeply. Not everything needs to be remembered. Some moments are allowed to be complete within themselves. This impermanence is not loss. It is efficiency. It prevents overload. Knowledge recognizes this and stops demanding retention. It accepts forgetting as part of functioning, not failure. Together, they allow experience to flow rather than accumulate. This flow does not erase meaning. It redistributes it. Meaning is no longer concentrated in a few defining events. It spreads across continuity. Life feels less like a series of turning points and more like a sustained movement. Memory adapts to this movement by tracking tone rather than detail. Knowledge adapts by tracking patterns rather than explanations. The result is coherence without rigidity. Identity becomes less about what is remembered and more about how one moves through experience. There is less need to anchor the self to past outcomes or future expectations. The present becomes sufficient. This sufficiency is quiet. It does not demand recognition. It is simply there, like warmth lingering after the fire has settled into embers. Knowing and remembering continue their work, but without tension. One clarifies, one carries, neither insists. And in that non-insistence, experience finds a steady rhythm that does not need to be named to be real. As this rhythm settles, the mind gradually stops measuring itself against its own history. There is less checking, less internal accounting. Memory no longer demands constant reference to what has already occurred, and knowledge no longer insists on framing every experience within a larger narrative. Life becomes less comparative. Moments are not weighed against past versions of the self or imagined future outcomes. They are allowed to stand on their own. This standing alone gives experience a quiet dignity. Memory records it without urgency. Knowledge observes it without pressure. Over time, this reduces the sense that life must be understood to be valid. Understanding becomes optional rather than compulsory. There is a growing tolerance for ambiguity, not as confusion, but as openness. Memory, once vigilant, now recognizes that not every unknown leads to harm. Knowledge, once eager to resolve, now recognizes that not every unknown needs resolution. This mutual recognition softens the inner environment. Emotional responses become proportional. Joy does not feel fragile. Sadness does not feel catastrophic. Both are experienced as states rather than signals. Memory allows them to pass without attaching long-term meaning. Knowledge allows them to be felt without immediately categorizing them. This changes how meaning itself is constructed. Meaning becomes cumulative rather than declarative. It emerges from consistency, not from explanation. A life feels meaningful not because it has been decoded, but because it has been inhabited. Memory senses this inhabitation through familiarity with calm rather than familiarity with threat. Knowledge senses it through coherence rather than control. Together, they support a form of presence that does not require constant validation. This presence is not passive. It is attentive without being tense. It notices without grasping. It responds without rehearsing. Over time, this quality alters how challenges are met. Difficulty is no longer interpreted as regression. It is integrated as part of movement. Memory registers challenge without immediately referencing past failures. Knowledge addresses challenge without framing it as proof of inadequacy. The system absorbs stress without fragmenting. This absorption does not rely on strength. It relies on flexibility. Memory bends instead of bracing. Knowledge adapts instead of insisting. The result is endurance without rigidity. Life continues to present uncertainty, loss, change. These elements do not disappear. What changes is their impact. They no longer reorganize identity. They no longer dominate attention for extended periods. Memory acknowledges them and releases them. Knowledge contextualizes them and moves on. In this way, experience becomes self-renewing. It does not accumulate indefinitely. It circulates. What is needed remains accessible. What is no longer needed fades naturally. There is no dramatic ending to this process, no final insight that seals it. It simply continues, adjusting, recalibrating, refining. Knowing and remembering remain present, but they no longer define the foreground of awareness. They become support structures rather than focal points. The mind rests more often in what is occurring rather than in what has occurred or what might occur. This resting is not indifference. It is alignment, an alignment where understanding and experience no longer compete for authority. One offers clarity when required. The other offers continuity without intrusion. And between them, life unfolds at its own pace, steady, unspectacular, and quietly sufficient. As the process reaches this later stage, there is less emphasis on progress and more on maintenance. Knowing and remembering no longer feel like forces pulling in different directions, but like background systems quietly doing their work. There is an understanding that they will never stop operating, and that they do not need to. The goal was never to silence memory or perfect knowledge, but to allow both to function without overwhelming experience. At this point, awareness rests more easily in what is unfolding rather than in what is being evaluated. Memory continues to register patterns, but it does so with less urgency, as if it trusts that not every sensation requires immediate classification. Knowledge continues to interpret, but it does not rush to conclusions or demand coherence where none is necessary. This creates a subtle sense of continuity that does not rely on constant reassurance. Life feels less fragmented. Moments connect not through explanation, but through rhythm. One experience flows into the next, without the need to constantly reference what came before. Memory notices this flow and accepts it as evidence of stability. Knowledge notices it and refrains from interrupting. Over time, this reduces the internal noise that once accompanied decision-making. Choices emerge from alignment rather than debate. Actions feel proportionate to situations rather than driven by old momentum. Even reflection changes character. Looking back no longer feels like searching for answers. It feels like observing terrain already crossed, familiar but no longer demanding attention. Memory holds it lightly. Knowledge acknowledges it without reopening it. The present remains the primary point of contact. This does not make life simpler, but it makes it less crowded. There is more room for nuance, more tolerance for imperfection, more acceptance of fluctuation. Emotions rise and fall without being immediately absorbed into identity. Thoughts appear and pass without needing to be believed or dismissed. Memory records selectively. Knowledge contextualizes gently. Together, they allow experience to remain dynamic without becoming destabilizing. The fire has burned long enough that its flames are lower now, steadier, less dramatic. It no longer crackles sharply, it glows. The heat is consistent, predictable, sufficient. In that glow, there is no need to watch constantly. One can sit nearby without vigilance, knowing it will continue without intervention. Knowing and remembering reach a similar state. They do not require constant monitoring. They simply persist, doing what they were designed to do. And within that persistence, there is a quiet form of trust. Trust that experience can unfold without being constantly managed. Trust that the past can remain influential without becoming intrusive. Trust that understanding does not need to arrive all at once to be real. The story does not end with resolution. It ends with steadiness, with continuation, with the sense that nothing essential is missing and nothing essential needs to be added. At the very close of this movement, what remains is not a lesson, but a condition. Knowing and remembering settle into their final, quiet arrangement, not fixed, but stable enough to carry forward. There is no announcement that balance has been reached, no signal that the work is complete. Instead, there is an absence of urgency where urgency once lived. The inner world no longer feels like something that must be managed minute by minute. Memory still contains the past, but it no longer spills into the present without invitation. Knowledge still frames experience, but it no longer competes with feeling for authority. The present becomes less crowded by interpretation and more defined by direct contact. This does not remove complexity. It removes excess. What remains is enough awareness to navigate, enough memory to remain grounded, enough openness to allow new experience without immediate defense. Identity feels less like a structure built from accumulated moments and more like a continuity of presence that adapts as it moves. The self is no longer held together by constant reference to what has been endured or understood. It is held together by rhythm, by repetition of ordinary moments lived without resistance. Memory recognizes this rhythm as safety. Knowledge recognizes it as coherence. Neither needs to claim ownership. They function together without negotiation. In this state, the difference between knowing and remembering is still clear but no longer divisive. One belongs to the mind's clarity. The other belongs to the body's history. Each informs without overruling. Each contributes without demanding. The world is met as it is, not as a reminder, not as a prediction. Sounds occur and pass. Silence arrives and leaves. Thoughts move through without attaching. The fire, now reduced to embers, continues to give off warmth long after its brightest flames have gone. It no longer draws attention, yet its presence is undeniable. In the same way, what has been known and what has been remembered continue to warm the present without requiring focus. They support, without interrupting. They remain without insisting. And in that quiet persistence, there is completion without conclusion. Not an ending, but a stable continuation, where experience is allowed to flow forward, informed by the past, understood by the mind, and lived without needing to be held.